We are continuing in our sermon series entitled Flannelgragh David. I'm up here using my flannelgraph, piece of cardboard wrapped in material that tells the Bible story. And as I've been working on this, I've been looking up flannelgraph information. I ran across a website called ABC Jesus Loves Me, and it's about how teachers can teach their children, how people can teach their children. And one of the ways that it promotes teaching your children is through the flannel graph. And she said that there's basically four reasons the flannel graph is such a good thing. It's time tested. That it's been around for 75 years. In fact, some of you in this room, as Christians, grew up learning the Bible stories with a flannel graph. It's time tested. It's visual. So you've got only got the ability to hear the story of the Bible, but you get to see something to associate with it. Now, in her setting, she says, there's a couple other things, as teachers, interactive. You can have kids come up and move pieces on the things, which also makes it tactile, that they can touch. So they get a multi-sensory thing they get to see and stuff. And as I read that or listened to the video, I thought, well, I'm not letting any of you come up here and move and touch my pieces, all right? So you get to learn about David in two ways in this time-tested method that you can visually see. All right, that's what you're going to get out of this. And today we don't have a lot of a flannel graph. Actually, it's a very simple story, but it's a vital story. It's the story of David and Jonathan, and we've been kind of working through some progression of stuff. David had the enemy in Goliath, and then he had the not a friend, not an enemy in Saul. But today we reach the friendship of David and Jonathan. And it's not just an ordinary friendship. They're through experience, that there are different levels of relationships we have. There's community level. There's a sense in which you come in here and you're part of a community, and maybe you can recognize people's faces, but you don't know much about them. And from there we move to acquaintances. That's where I know one or two pieces of information about you. I don't know much more than that, but I have this group of people that I know a little bit about them. And from there we move to friends. This is a group from about 3 to 18 people, people that we know a lot about them. We know their story, their family, their background, and they know quite a bit about us. But then within that circle, we eventually reach this group who are one or two people of really best friends, of people that you're deeply committed to and share a relationship with. And that is the story of David and Jonathan, as two people who are very committed. And in today's culture, that's something we need to talk about, because we don't talk a lot about forming friendships. Although we have a lot of social media, we find a lot of lonely people. I was listening to one of the podcasts I listened to. It's called The Aggressive Life. All right. It's a pastor. He said, we don't need to be passive. We need to be aggressive, taking the life by the horns. And one of his guests he had on this past spring was a guy named Billy Dickens. And I did not know the name. He's from England, and he'd written a book. So we have put this in its British context. It was called Billy No Mates. Okay. Now you have to understand, mates in England is friends. All right. So Billy with no friends. That was the title of his book. And the reason he came to that was he was told the story about how he was planning to get married. He'd met a woman, and they were falling in love. And he said, I'm getting ready to put together our wedding, and I don't know who to be my best man. In fact, I don't even know if I have anybody to stand up with me. And so the book is his quest over the next year to find someone to not only be his best man, but to stand up and be a part of his wedding party. And we have too many people who are, you can put your name in there, no friends. We fit into that category. So how do we discover friends? How do we find friends? How do we know what a real friend is? Well, the story of David and Jonathan is going to help us. And we're going to go to a passage that it's unique because it tells the story of David and Jonathan, but it's also a setup for the rest of their story. So it starts in chapter 18, but it's going to continue on through into the very first chapter of 2 Samuel. And so we're getting something that you have. This is concrete what's going on, but you're going to see it played out over and over again in their life. So from 1 Samuel chapter 18, we pick up the first 4 verses. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword and his bow and his belt. in this 4 verses, I think there's 4 marks of a great relationship, 4 marks of a deep friendship. And what I want to do is just walk through and label each one of these verses as we go through it. Okay. The first one is there's this deep connection. So here, go to our flannel graph. So after David has slain Goliath, he comes back, and for the first time, we're introduced to this new character uh, in the David story. His name is Jonathan. So David is still a teenager. He's just slain Goliath. He comes back, and he meets King Saul's son, Jonathan, and they become fast friends, and they have this deep connection. But when you first see them, um, they appear to have nothing in common. Okay? David is a shepherd boy. Oops. He was raised with brothers as the youngest, and he was kept tending the sheep, which also means that they were fairly poor. He's still a young man. He has no influence. On the other side, we have we have Jonathan. Jonathan is Saul's son. He's his oldest son. He's in line to the throne. He was raised in a palace. He's a prince. And what you might not know is he's between 10 and 15 years older than David. Most scholars put him at about 12 years, but that's really hard to pin down. So we have these two, and when you first see them, they don't seem to have anything in common, but yet they strike up this friendship. So here's what verse 1 gives us, is this deep connection. It says, when they finished talking, then Jonathan became one in spirit with David. Let's pause right there. The two of them, in some passages, it says they were knit together. It's kind of hard to translate. It's really more of a word picture. It's a picture of 3 strands. And you have David on one side and Jonathan on the other and God in the middle. And they're being woven into one solid rope, one solid thing. And so these two are their lives coming together in a unique way. Now, one scholar said it has conspiracy overtones, which you're going to find out a little bit later. We'll talk more about this. But, Saul, his son should be king. But it seems like Jonathan is working more with David to make him king. And that becomes kind of a motivation for them to work together. They have this one purpose, this one goal. I don't know how you think about this. I think in think about dynamic duos with David and Jonathan. I was thinking about all the different dynamic duos. I think about, comedy. There was Abbott and Costello, Laurel and Hardy. Those were names that are linked together. Maybe you think about sports, all right? I date myself a little bit this. We've got Jordan and Pippen. We've got Stockton and Malone. You've got two people that complement each other. Maybe you think about literature and something like that, like Sherlock Holmes and Watson, or maybe this is your speed, maybe Batman and Robin. I don't know. We'll dumb it down as far as we can till we hit you. You have this idea of two people working together towards a common goal. There's something that brings them together, and it knits them together. I'm going to pause right there. One of the things our church is going to do in 1 month is we're going to unveil some small groups. I'm working on this. If you're interested in being a part of something like this, we're going to have 2 types of small groups. Some of them are gather groups and some of them are grow groups, okay? So some of them we're going to be doing Bible study. Others we're just going to get together. You just have something in common. And the goal is that you will get together, meet somebody that you have something in common with, and you can begin a friendship, a relationship within the church, whatever it may be. Even if it's just as simple as you just like to get together to eat and talk. So we have those kinds of things. And then the second part of this verse says, and he loved him as himself. Now, I have to be 100% honest with you that this troubles people, this word love. It's actually a bookend statement, okay? So when David first meets Jonathan, it says that he loves him. When last thing he says about him in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 26, he said he loved him more than women. And as a result, this problem has become that people nowadays, through their 2023 eyes, look back and say, it was probably an inappropriate relationship because there's all that talk about love. And they have a problem with the idea that 2 men could say that they love one another. And the problem with that is that they confuse love and lust. That if you care about someone, then surely there has to be some sort of physical attraction going on. And so they've taken this couple in 2023 eyes, they look back and they go, well, they must have been a homosexual couple. There is no evidence to that forever. That's a new and modern translation. David will go on to get married, have many children, seems to have too much love for the women at some point. On the other side, on the other side, both of these men are completely committed to the Old Testament and to the Lord, this would have been found as an abomination. There's no reason other than to misinterpret the passage. Again, we're importing our ideas about trying to understand love and lust. And the reality is, I'm going to define this for you one more time. All right. Love in biblical terms is action. I don't ever want you to lose that. It's this idea that I do the right thing for another person. And so love is not just an expression of motion or expression of desire. It's an expression of my concern for you. All right? I heard a comedian tell this story. He said, I was traveling home one night. My car broke down beside the road, so I picked up my phone and I called my wife. So my car broke down. I said, she told me right then, said, well, you know it's been having trouble. You should have gotten it in. I told you needed to get the car fixed. Why didn't you go get it fixed? So I hung up and I called my friend. I said, hey, my car's broke down. He says, hey, tell me where you're at and I'll come get you. Do you understand love in that scenario? The idea is that throughout the story of David and Jonathan, they're continually doing things for one another out of concern for the other. And that concern is built around this idea that they are knit together in this life. I was trying to think of other people that have come together. One that immediately came to my mind, I did a little research that they met, first time they met was in 1926. They didn't realize how their lives would become so intertwined, because by the time you fast forward a few years, they both end up being professors at Oxford University. They both were joined together for the rest of their lives, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. They said that what brought them together, I love this description, was their love of story and language. They loved to tell a good story and to write it in a way. Little did they know the two of them pushing each other as friends on this common goal would result in some of the best literature we have for the next 100 years. And we still read The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and we still read Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters, all because of their commitment and their work together. These two, David and Jonathan, have a deep connection. Second thing is they're going to spend time together. Time together is a big factor. Verse 2, from that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. Now, the way this is stated, it almost kind of comes off in a negative way. It's like he's being kept a prisoner. So you have to understand the context. Up to this point, David has continually gone up to the palace. And whenever Saul was tormented by an evil spirit, he would play his lyre and soothe him down. And he would then go back home. And when Saul would go off to war, David was back to tending the sheep. And then he would come back to the palace when he was needed. So he's always coming and going. At this point in time, things transition because now he's going to live at the palace with the family. These two are going to be together all the time. And you know what happens when you spend time together? Is you begin to realize all the things you have in common. You begin to see all of your connections. That's one of the great things, by the way, about things like church camp and CIY, is you throw a group of kids together and they're going to find relationships they didn't know existed before. I think in this story, they probably sat around in the evening and Jonathan says, I want you to tell me that story about Goliath. I mean, I can't imagine going out and to fight a giant. So David tells his story about fighting Goliath, and Jonathan looks and goes, man, that's a lot like what happened in my life. And you go, what? See, the problem is most of you know 1 Samuel chapter 17, David and Goliath. You don't know 1 Samuel chapter 14. So in chapter 14, the Philistines have come up against the Israelites, and Jonathan is sick of it. He wants to do something about it, so he grabs his armor bearer. He says, we're going to go fight. And as they're out on the way to the battle, this is what he says in chapter 14 to his armor bearer. This is the second half of verse 6. It says, nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. See, Jonathan says, I'm going to go out, him and his armor bearer, which his armor bearer is going to basically carry his weapons, carry his armor, is we're going to go out and we're going to fight. He goes, we don't need to have the whole army to go this fight. The two of us are enough. God can save whether it's many or few. And the rest of that story is that Jonathan killed 20 Philistines by himself. I don't know which requires more faith. Do you? Does it require more faith to defeat one 8-foot giant, or does it require more faith to beat 20 Philistines? I don't know, but I know that they found this common bond, that we both have this faith that just overcomes any obstacle, faith to trust that God will do anything amazing. And these two that seem so different find that they're very much alike. I'm going to go back to our small group thing. So the reason we're doing this, I've been seeing this need for some time that we need to get smaller groups going, and we look to hire somebody. That's still not worked out the way we wanted to, so I'm trying to put together some groups. Here's why. Okay, through the first 6 months of this year, right, we averaged 233 people every week in our church, 233. And there is no way for you to know all those people, okay? You're just going to be part of this bigger community. And here's the problem, is if you come to church, once, twice, maybe even as much as 3 times a month, you're here at church, you're never going to get connected to other people in that 1 hour 3 times a month. It's impossible. You don't have enough time together. And see, here's what happens all the times. People come to church and they come for 3, 4 months, and then they finally leave. And I said, what happened? I said, I just didn't feel connected to anybody. Yeah, if this is all you get, you will never, ever, never, ever, never, ever, never, ever, ever feel connected. You have to get connected into smaller groups. You have to be serving in ministry alongside of people. You have to spend time together. It is only in those places where you will find relationships where you're sitting around and you're enjoying a meal together and you go, wow, we had a lot more in common than I thought we did. That's where relationships get built, is in time together. Third thing in this is commitment. Go to verse 3. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. He made a covenant. The covenant means an agreement. They came together. Now, honestly, I don't know what this looks like. Okay, we don't get any kind of detail or explanation. I know how my mind works. I started thinking, well, he's rich, son of a king. They probably got a lawyer to draw up some paperwork. They said down, you sign there, I sign there. I don't know. I come from a generation that was a little bit different. Okay, if you're 50 and older, you're going to identify with this. All right, we had a thing when I was a kid called blood brothers. All right, you'd cut yourself and they'd cut themselves and you rub your blood together. We don't do that now in 2023. One, it's probably not good to rub your blood together. Plus, I'm imagining our generation was a little tougher than some of the kids today, but that's a whole nother story. But we do have these rites of initiation, rites of connection. My boys, 3 of them got involved in fraternities. Every one of them had a rush week, a pledge week. I don't even want to know what they did during that week. But I know that there was a declaration that I am committed to this group. And that's an important thing, to be committed, to stand by one another. One other form of way somebody did this that I found was interesting, Bill McCartney, who started Promise Keepers. Before that, he was coach at the University of Colorado football. And he would have players, as the story goes, that would stand back to back. And they would have to declare out loud in front of the team, I will say and do things behind your back the same way I will do to your face. You can rely on me. I've got your back. I'm not going to talk about you behind it. There's this level of commitment that has to go along with that, which is significant in the story of David. Because when you get to chapter 20, you're going to find that King Saul has a plot that he's planning a trap to catch David. Jonathan catches wind of it, and he goes and tells David, and they have a signal all worked out and a plan so that it saves his life. He literally had to have his back a few times. And the story. It says they had a covenant, they had an agreement. It's actually interesting. It's the same word that scholars tell us, what I read, same word that God used of his agreement with his people. He had this commitment that would last. Now, I don't know if you need anything written down. I don't need if you need some sort of initiation. I know that it has to be more than just words. When Michelle and I were talking about getting married, we decided we were going to get married in June. We started doing some premarital counseling. We were about a year out at this point, and one of the first things our premarital counselor sat down with us, a professor, and he talked about our story, and he says, why are you waiting clear till a year from now to get married? Because what's keeping you from getting married sooner? And so we talked about, well, this, and this, and after spending some time and a week talking about, praying about it, we decided to move it from June back to December 31st. I called all the people that were supposed to be in my wedding party, and I said, hey, look, we're going to move it back. And one by one, they said, well, we can't be there. We can't be there. It's Christmas break, and there was all kinds of excuses. But my buddy Landis, I called Landis, and I said, hey, we're looking at moving back. He goes, buddy, you just tell me where it's at, and whatever's going on, I'll cancel it, and I'll be there. And Landis stood up as my best man in my wedding. Commitment. Last thing is sacrifice. The story ends in kind of a unique way. It says Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and he gave it to David along with his tunic and his sword, his bow and his belt. What is he doing? Well, you need to understand the complete context of what's going on. As prince, as the king's son, you wore the attire that said, I'm the next in line for the throne. Okay? You're wearing stuff that was specially made, special swords, special clothes to indicate that I am next in line to the throne. I am a prince. And what he's doing is when he meets David, he says, no, you're the one that God wants. He's giving him all of the signs that I'm someone of position and power, and he gives it to David and says, no, you are the person who should be the next king. It's an incredibly selfless act. It's an action of saying, you know what, it's not about me. This relationship is about you. And see, I can tell you this, of all the ways that you form friendships, the one way you will never form a friendship is by being selfish. When you come into any relationship and you say, what's in it for me? And that's your dominant question, you are never going to develop a deep connection. But when you're willing to sacrifice and give of yourself, it's a now famous story, even though there's some things to figure out within it. Jackie Robinson, he was the first African-American ball player in the major leagues. And when he went to Cincinnati, was his first game. And in pregame, the fans were booing, yelling. And as the story goes, the team captain, Pee Wee Reese, walked over to him, and at risk to himself at that time of racial separation, he put his arm around him and stood there until the crowd was silent. In fact, they've got a statue made of that moment. Now, the problem is, when Jackie Robinson released his autobiography, Pee Wee Reese said it happened at the first game in Cincinnati in 1947. Jackie Robinson said it happened in 1948 at a different stadium. We don't know what to make of that, so historians have kind of reached this conclusion, that it's possible that it happened more than one time. That when they would have a pregame, of course back then nothing's on TV as it is now, and they had a pregame, it was common when he would walk into another stadium that people would begin to boo. At least once, maybe twice, maybe even more. Pee Wee Reese would walk over and put his arm around him to say, we stand together, and if you hate him, you also are going to have to hate me. It's a simple story. Two men whose lives get intertwined. I don't have a lot of Flannelgragh stuff today. I have that one, and I have this one. This is going to fast forward some time. See, because these two are going to become friends, and they're going to stay friends for the next 15 years until Jonathan's untimely death. They're going to stay committed to one another, helping one another, serving one another, saving each other's lives in this one beautiful friendship. Now, as I think about that story, I was just trying to figure out, what are some of the ways that we can apply this? One way we can apply this is simply, how do we make friends? For some of us in here, that's a reality. How do we make friends? I went articles And I read through a bunch of secular articles telling you, here's how you go and make friends. And they all come back to one of these, or if not all of these. You need to have some kind of connection. You need to be spending time together. You need to be committed to one another and to the relationship, and you need to be willing to give up and be selfless in that. All articles kind of come back to these same basic principles. And some of you in here, you need to hear this because it's hard to make relationships as an adult. And I'm saying this from experience. 5 different times in my life, I've packed up everything I've owned and I've driven into a town where I did not know a single person. Quite literally. One time I moved to a town where there wasn't even a church. Now I'm going to tell you, just by personal experience, you want to know the hardest place in the world to find relationships is in a small town. If you didn't grow up here, see that loving, wonderful little community, you say, oh, we all just care so much about one another. If you grew up here. If you didn't, it's a tough road. And I walk into a community, I try to do these things. I wish I could give you a guarantee. If you do these 4 things, you know what, and you stick to them at some point in time, you know, you're going to, X amount of years, you're going to have X amount of friends. It's going to be a great experience. I can't give you a guarantee. But I can tell you if you keep working at these 4 things is the only way you'll ever make relationships, is to continue to give yourself over to the ways of the Lord and try to connect and give and serve. The other thing I want to say today is that for some of you in here, as I told the story of David and Jonathan, you already substituted the names. You've already been thinking about that person in your life who you've known them since you were kids. You've known them since college. You've known them since your first job. And I mean, you just connected. And I mean, you contact them over and over, and you are just deeply committed. Can I encourage you to do something? If you have somebody like that in your life today, send them an email, send them a text, make a phone call, reach out to them and just say, I want to thank you for your friendship. I want to thank you for the years you've stayed committed to me. I want to thank you for the way you've selflessly given yourself to me. I want to thank you for being my friend. A paper in England ran a contest trying to get the best definition of friendship. They got a lot of really good answers. I read through a few of them. A friend is someone who understands your silence. I like that. A friend is like a watch. It's always there and always on time. But the winner of their contest, a friend is someone who comes in when the whole world has gone out. Someone who comes in when the whole world has gone out. I'm going to ask a simple question. Who is the Jonathan in your life? Or maybe another way. Who are you being a Jonathan to? Because we all need people like Jonathan. Let's pray. Father God,